You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you the latest podcast from the Wildlife Control Consultant Company. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I'm actually recording an additional podcast this weekend. I'm trying to get a little ahead on my schedule so that because I've got some more travel ahead of me. It's been a pretty heavy travel year, so I guess I shouldn't complain over people want to hear me speak, and so I'm certainly grateful for that. If you're new to the podcast, you're wondering what we're all about, we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. So we try to take a little bit more of an academic approach, a technical approach, and so we will talk about control methods, trap use and this sort of thing, but typically from a research perspective where we're dealing with data that's been recorded and research in terms of comparison rather than anecdotal information that could be gained from someone who has just been gleaning information from the field. As important as that is, you got to have some of that field experience, and those podcasts are certainly out here. Our approach is that we tend to look at some of the scientific literature, some more technical information that really takes some time and reading for someone to glean. Like no one's going to get experience to understand whether histoplasmosis spores grow inside of a dry attic, for example. That's not going to happen from experience. You got to have research to do some of that. So that's kind of where our focus is, and we try to take a little different stance on things just simply because we want to make sure we're not overlapping a lot of the other important podcasts that are out there as well. So enough about that. Want to be sure if you have questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions for future shows, you can definitely reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you're interested in even being on the show, definitely reach out and suggest how you could be informing of our audience that's in wildlife damage management. Well, this week I want to talk about a book I just completed reading about. Let me, I don't think I have it quite handy with it, but I do have a photo of it. I brought it back downstairs. Let me pull my PowerPoint up and so you can see it. And as many of you know, I am passionate about vertebrate pest inspection. As you may know, I wrote a book on the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook, 3rd edition revised. And it's sort of a passion of mine because unless you properly identify the culprit, you could be really wasting a lot of your time. So I'm always interested in reading materials, learning from people about how to be a better inspector and to make sure we're identifying all the available evidence that we're encountering to understand the animals that we're looking to go after. And so this is a book that I came across. It was part of a set of 3, sort of a anniversary type edition from this gentleman named Tristan Gooley. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. And the book's title is How to Read Nature. Now, again, it came into a box set of 3 books, and this is the first one that I read. I don't think it's the first one he published. From what I'm reading, so I was trying to read it in chronological order, and I think I read it out of chronological order, but maybe I'm reading it, hopefully. This was the thinnest of the 3 books, and I assumed How to Read Nature would be foundational for the other 2 books that I read. One of them is How to Read Water, and I think the other one is How to Read the Environment. So I'd have to try to remember that name. But anyways, it doesn't matter for the moment. But this gentleman is quite unique in terms of his approach. But let me give you a little background. This comes from his book. I don't know this gentleman personally, and I'm not making any money off of talking about his book. He has not hired me to do this. I'm not making any money on this at all. I don't. So his name again is Tristan Gooley. And the book's title is How to Read Nature, Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You Never Noticed. Taste, direction, smell time, hear the weather, and more. And so he is a specialist in this field I didn't even know existed, called natural navigation. And so a field may be overstating it somewhat. But his philosophy is how can we navigate without the modern tools of the contemporary world, like GPS? How do you navigate without even using a compass, for example? What would be the tools? And so he's trying to understand nature and the signs that nature gives us to move around the landscape, which is truly remarkable. I would love to see what he would do in the sandhills, because the sandhills, there are no geographical markers, right? You have no mountains to look for. When you're out in the middle of it, it feels like you're on a blank slate practically. Obviously, that's not true because there's sandhills, but one sandhill looks like the next sandhill. I would be fascinated to see what his approach would be to that. But what he will do is he actually tries to observe nature to the point where he can understand and get clues from trees, for example, the tree branches, how they're growing off of the trunk to determine which way the wind's blowing. And he knows that in certain parts of the world, the wind always blows from the west to the east. Therefore, he would say the tree can tell you what is west and what is east just by looking at the tree itself, which is, I never would have thought of doing that. But this is kind of the approach that he takes. Just to show you a little bit more of the kind of life that he lives, he's led expeditions. People go with him up to on all 5 continents, which is certainly, I'm sure, a pretty small number of people have ever made it to all 5 continents, to be sure. And he has spent time with various tribal peoples to learn how they navigate the world and interact with their environment. So he's really put some serious energy in, and he doesn't even look that old. I think when the photo, I was probably maybe in his 40s or 50s now. So he has had quite the life, and according to his book, he is the only living person right now who has soloed the Atlantic by plane and by boat. So let's take a little exploration on this particular book and see if it's something that you, as a wildlife control professional or a pest control professional, may be interested in reading, because I'll have some concluding thoughts about the book and perhaps its usefulness or its lack of usefulness for those in the wildlife control field. So in terms of how the book is designed, it's not very long. It's a relatively small book. He is a superb writer, and so it's very relatively easy to read. But some of the concepts he's talking about, though, it definitely reorients you in terms of nature. But he has the major sections delineated in his book as follows. So he has an introduction. I think that's 3 pages. Then he has a section called The Ground Ahead, Finding a Path, Getting Closer, Deeper Reading, and then Homework. Deeper Reading is, I think, he has several pages of recommended books if you want to continue your journey on how to read nature more deeply. And then he has Homework. I think these are examples of some things that you might want to do in order to continue this path that he wants to put you on. And so what is his goal, right? So in terms of his goal, well, the introduction says it relatively straightforwardly, and then he's talking about the importance of reading nature, not just having philosophical views about it. So this book is not about giving you a philosophy of life per se, right? He's not looking to argue with people about his approach per se. He wants to just simply get readers to think and perceive the clues that nature is sending us more deeply in understanding it. Because when you think about it, we're really a distracted world. I'm just holding up my cell phone here, right? We're distracted. And that can be the same thing that occurs with us in our wildlife control work. You're like, oh, squirrel job. Same thing, different day. Now, we don't want to overstate the differences, right? It's not rocket science per se, but you have to ask the question, how many clues are you missing that the squirrel has left behind, for example, that would help you resolve that problem for the client more quickly. That takes a little bit of time. And of course, in wildlife control, time is extraordinarily precious, right? Because it's a very time-intensive field. But you're not going to be able to improve your approach unless, as I've said multiple times in this podcast series that I've done, unless you do things differently, right? Unless you look at things from a different perspective and evaluate your work practices, you're not going to be able to have a competitive edge over your competition, right? So this is what this book will do. It tries to, it's sort of like how would the world look if you were a left-handed person, right? Instead of I'm a right-handed person, but how would the world look if I was a left-handed person, right? That's a fundamental shift in terms of how we're viewing things. So the next section that he has is the ground ahead, and this is where he's trying to get you mentally prepared to look deeply at nature, right? And so his goal for you is to seek to figure out why is this happening and the interconnectedness of nature. Let me try to use an illustration that wouldn't be in the book, but something for your own life. For example, you're going to a structure. There are squirrels in that structure. Why are there squirrels in that structure? You say, well, the wood got rotten. Okay, why did the wood get rotten? Well, they didn't clean their gutters. Why didn't they clean their gutters? Maybe because there's a tree nearby. Maybe because they missed it. Maybe because that part of the house doesn't get sun, right? And so then you're starting to think of, well, if that's the case, then are other jobs that I'm going on with squirrels, is there a certain portion of the house that's more likely to have squirrel entry versus others? I mean, that question's certainly been asked for bats, for example. Do bats enter a structure at a certain direction? In other words, is it more on the southerly side of the house? Is it more the southwesterly side of the house? The northern side of the house? And so this would be a question you would want to be asking, but you can't find the answer unless you're asking the question, right? The theory will tell you what you can perceive, and that we need to sometimes narrow down and keep asking the question, why? What is the relationship? Is that squirrel getting onto the building from a tree branch? Is he climbing a gutter? Is he using a power line, right? That is what his philosophy of his approach, I probably should say, to help you reorient yourself. And he has little exercises in his chapters to try to force you to perceive nature differently. One of his exercises is just going outside and closing your eyes and just sit there for 3 minutes, and what do you experience? Now that's kind of changing, right? I mean, you're going to see the world in a different way if you're not looking at it, right? And so this would be an exercise, something that he would recommend that you use, so that, because there's so much we miss when we are exploring nature. Now, for us, we're interacting with nature. It's in a human impacted environment, so it's not, fully natural as we normally use the term. But how are the animals adapting to our urban environment, and what clues are they giving us that we're missing, right? And that's kind of where he's going with this. So then he moves on. So what's the method or the process by which we can learn to read nature more deeply, that we're paying attention to the subtle clues that nature is giving us. And so he wants you to begin somewhere, right? And so, as I gave you in this illustration, go outside and just simply close your eyes. If you're in an attic, for example, and you're trying to do an inspection of an attic, have you ever just simply stopped, turned off your flashlight, and just sat there for a few moments and just simply, what am I experiencing just with my other senses? Is there a breeze that you might have felt across your cheek, right? Is there a smell that you didn't pay attention to? That may be tough going through your respirator, right? But odors can still penetrate respirators depending what you're using. But what kind of sounds are you experiencing, right? So are you feeling any vibrations through the attic floor, for example? That could be a clue. So these are some things that don't do this stuff unless you feel safe, right? I wouldn't do it if you saw the mama raccoon off in the corner, right? I wouldn't be closing your eyes, but be careful. But you get the idea in terms of what are we missing when we're inspecting, because there's so much that we don't see. I once worked as an X-ray orderly, not a technician, an X-ray orderly. And I was talking with one of the radiologists, and he says that he misses 90%, I think he said 90% of what was on the X-ray slide. He only sees like 10%. Now here we have a medical doctor, a trained professional who specializes in reading X-rays, and he's saying how much he misses in an X-ray. How much do we miss? And we have nowhere near the training that a medical doctor who specializes in radiology misses. Okay, I hope that kind of sets our attitude in the approach that he is trying to bring us here, right? So he provides some exercises to help us refocus, and then he discusses things, what he calls relationships, finer connections, and conflicts. And what he means by this is that, are you thinking about the relationships that you're seeing in nature? What's the relationship between that tree and where it occurs? Is there water there? Is there a certain soil structure there? What species of tree is it? Finer connections between things. Maybe there's an ant colony nearby. Why is that ant colony there? And then looking at conflicts, how are those trees interacting with the grass maybe around it? So, because nature is conflict, and because it's constricted resources, right? So one plant is fighting another plant, and learning to read these connections just to observe them. Why are certain plants occurring in that location and not other plants in that location? And so he discusses some of those concepts for you. The next section in his book is called Getting Closer, and this is where he transitions for you to think about time. Time in a macro sense, think like calendars and seasons, particularly like seasons. How are you noticing the change in seasons? And for us, that would mean the change of seasons would be how animals are interacting with their environment. Like, what are they doing in the fall? What are they doing in the winter? What are they doing in the spring and summer? And how does that change their behavior? How does that change their foraging, for example, and the behavior the damage that they do? Are we being sensitive, or do they do different kinds of damage in different seasons? Have we even thought about that? And then he wants to narrow that down to even how is an animal or nature dealing with day and night. Nocturnal animals, diurnal animals, right? So that would be something else for to think about. But then he wants you to get even deeper, and this is where he wants you to look internally to yourself, because you're part of nature, right? And so he wants you to think about your own circadian rhythms. Now, there's been some work in this area, circadian rhythms. How do I describe it? I'm not sure I fully understand all that it is, but it's sort of like the internal time clock for our body. Think of it as some people are night owls, some people are early risers, some people really their peak time is 10 to noon, other people their peak time may be noon to 2. It's just sort of genetic. That's why you had that movement a while back of getting teenagers to be able to go to school later in the day, because then they would be more attentive, for example. I'm not sure how that all played out, because I think kids would probably just stay up later and later at night. But nevertheless, that's the philosophy behind that. And so he also then wants you to keep practicing this process, because it's a skill that you got to work into, because it's hard, because when you're learning how to observe nature more carefully, it's tiresome, right? It takes time and energy and effort to look at greater details rather than just walking down the street, seeing who you can text and scrolling on various social media apps, right? And then he steps back and says he wants you to acknowledge the growth. He calls it that everyone experiences, there's always two people in the woods. Yourself in the present and yourself in the past. Who you were, what was the person that walked into the woods versus in the past versus who you are now walking in the woods. Well, that would be the same question we would ask for wildlife control operators, right? Who were you before you read the book and who were you now after the book? Something definitely to think about. But he wants you to acknowledge the growth that you've had. Now, what do we do with this as wildlife control operators? And so let me just sort of state straight away, if you're a new wildlife control operator, by new, that's going to vary in terms of the amount of workload that you've been involved in, but I would suggest if you're probably haven't been in business for 5 years, I'll say full time just to sort of put a parameter on it. I'm not sure this book is for you. Okay, I would think that I would have you read other books because when you're in the early phases of your career, it is really important for you to pile on the money and pile it on in a hurry and really get yourself established. So I don't think the book would be suitable for you. So I would just simply say, something to think about, maybe put it on your calendar if you have a 5-year calendar or something, or use your cell phone to go out 5 or 6 years in the future, write it in and say, in 6 years, I'm going to read this book. Because I think it takes time for you to get ready to think that you need to take your inspection skills and your observation skills to another level. And I think in your first 5 years, you've got other things going on. So don't read it. I'm not going to recommend the book. If you are mature in your work with wildlife control, maybe you took over the business for somebody else and the business is well established, you have a lot of experience. Perhaps you were trapping for a long period of time before you even got into wildlife control as a business, then you may want to consider reading this particular book because it's going to reorient the way you look at nature and the way you look at sign and how you perceive your work in the environment. And so I try to apply this to the wildlife damage management field, right? And so what are the patterns that we're missing? I tried to allude to some earlier on that just might pique your interest, but I'm sure you can come up with others. For example, why is the mole in this lawn as opposed to another lawn? Why is it this lawn that always gets attacked? For those of you that have been, that get hired year after year for that particular property. Why is it this lawn, but not the neighbor's lawn, right? And so what is missing? What's different between those two? That would be kind of that deeper learning so that maybe you'd learn a control technique, maybe you'd learn a method of inspection that would be different. Even marketing, so that way the soil in that part of town is such that it doesn't get moles, for example, and so therefore you wouldn't advertise mole services in that part of town, right? It could be something that simple. What can you look for more deeply that would identify clues that would help you make more money? Or save money, or identify an animal faster, or perhaps identify its trail or route better so that maybe you could use a blind set rather than a baited set. That's the type of thing you'd want to look at. The person that really made me think about that I think exemplifies the principles of this book, if I had to suggest someone, again, he's kind of a friend of mine, a distant friend. He's out in New Jersey. I'm in Montana, obviously. His name is Ron Jones, and he didn't ask me to do this, right? So he has a company called ACP Wildlife Control Services, and I consider him what I would call the philosopher of wildlife damage management. His approach to things, if you follow him on Facebook or something, is very deep, and it kind of is working out in practice what this particular book is teaching. And just a reminder of what that book is, let me scroll back to it, right? How to Read Nature, Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed, Taste Direction, Smell Time, hear the weather, and more. I mean, that's just amazing. How do you taste direction, right? Well, that's kind of the deep way he wants us to observe nature. But I think Ron Jones is someone who lives this experience, and I doubt he has read this particular book. But if you're intrigued with how his approach to things is something that this book, I think, would help put you onto the path. But again, is it something that's going to put money in your pocket right away? The answer is no. If you're mature enough in looking to think differently about how you're observing the jobs that you're going to and looking for clues, this book is going to try to make you think, it's a cliche, outside of the box. Something for you to think about. Well, you can see my inspection book there. You can certainly purchase it in various locations or my website. Would love to have you. But do thank you for paying attention. We would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can be notified of future podcasts. I tend to publish once a week. But you can also reach out to me, of course, at my email address at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts, perhaps suggestions for future shows. Perhaps you have a question that you would like to get answered, or you even have a criticism. We'd love to hear that as well. Just try to be constructive in your criticism rather than just simply screaming about something that you didn't like. We'd certainly appreciate that. If you have interest in being on the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. We think there's so much information out there for people that have services and products that would be very helpful for people within the industry, and we want to be a part of getting that information out to a wider audience. Well, thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we deal with all things technical related to wildlife damage management. So really glad to have you on board. Take care, everyone. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.